Okay, good. That's good. So this is a lecture on how the South lost the Civil War and the process of emancipation, free at last. We're going to discuss the Southern defeat in the war, try to explain that it was more than just physical superiority of the North that led to victory. Here's the slide on emancipation. It's a pretty complicated story. Here's the story about African American troops in the Battle of the Republican John's body. How would you explain how slavery ended the Civil War? To what extent did the slaves free themselves? And how important was Lincoln in all this? So this is the beginning. Why did the South lose the war? We could phrase it as how did the North win the war? But I choose to look on it as something the South could have won, but they didn't. And why did that happen? Well, there are lots of reasons. Lincoln was a better wartime leader than Jefferson Davis. Certainly, the politics of the South was that you were either for the government's policy or you were against it. And a lot of people were against it and formed a variety of factions against the government. They had a 6-year limitation on the presidency, one term for 6 years. The North, meanwhile, had the Democratic Party. If you opposed the war or if you were against Lincoln's wartime policies, you could coalesce in the Democratic Party of the North. And so that political stability helped the North to win the war. They had all sorts of advantages. Population, industry, railroads, iron, coal, even all agricultural categories. But the Norse, except for cotton, of course, but the Norse advantages weren't enough to explain what happened. In the South, there were all sorts of, they almost won the war if they had taken the high ground at Gettysburg, if they had followed through on their victories in the Virginia campaign, the North could have won. All they had to do, the South could have won, excuse me. All they had to do was hang on, wait for the North to give up. But they did not do that. They fought open field battles involving big military confrontations, and the South lost these battles. The South nearly won, but they lacked the support of the non-slaveholders, the population of 3/4 of white families that did not own slaves. They barely supported secession, and they fell away as the war began to go badly for them. So all that is to say that the South could have won the war, but they lacked the social support network to allow them to win. The South instituted the draft first. They ran out of soldiers. In the first year of the war, there was a 100% filling of the ranks. They wanted to prove to the North that they could not defeat the South on their homeland. And to a great extent, they continued through the war. But soon the South had to draft uh, people. But there was a 20 Negro law which allowed you to get out of the draft for every 20 Negroes owned. A white person got out of the draft. They had consolidated military. They did not have local control that was controlled by the central government. Uh, the South uh, fought a war that required the Southern non-slaveholder to give a lot to the cause, and the South did not appreciate that as time went on. The South began to plunder their own people. They taxed their people in kind. They required them to pay their taxes in goods. They suffered from tremendous inflation. The North had tremendous inflation of about 80% in the war years, but the Confederacy saw their paper money was worthless and they began to print more of it. And pretty soon the South would not accept their own money for payment of taxes. Their inflation rate was so usually around 9,000% was what the inflation was, and people could keep up with that. Finally, the South plundered their own people by confiscating everything they came in touch with, so that the North, the South, did not pay for the goods they stole from local farmers. So this led to a lot of opposition among non-slave holding white families. The South got so desperate they considered arming the slaves, putting Black people into the Confederate Army so they would fight for the South. This never really happened. The Confederate government passed a law that would form Black regiments right at the end of the war, but they were never formed because Lee surrendered to Grant in the meantime. So the South was divided by deep social cleavages that were not really addressed during the war. So all that is to say that the South failed to take advantage of the position they had at the outbreak of the war. Now, in the North, they emancipated the slaves in a number of ways. I tell the story of Chillicothe, Ohio, that there was a young man who was there living where I was. I met him when he asked me at about 12:15 a.m. after midnight if I'd like his snake, the python that was wrapped around his neck from knee to knee. And I just said it was a lovely snake. Great job there. And this guy asked me what I was doing in Chillicothe. I told him I was studying antebellum racism and the reasons why Blacks were treated as second-class citizens in this county. And this caused him to become thoughtful and to tell me that what bothered him about Black people today was that they're free because of a white man. And you rarely hear Blacks thankful for that. Well, I just said that I had to get back to my century now and thanked him for his input and didn't talk to him again. But the last few months have shown that America still is in the throes of this. We still haven't come to grips to the extent that emancipation was an African American movement that involved white people as well. So Benjamin Butler was one of the first generals to push Lincoln along. Lincoln, of course, wanted to keep the loyalty of the border states. And so there was a long time before he came around to the idea of emancipation. Benjamin Butler began to notice these runaway slaves would weaken the enemy. So he began to let them into his camp. And the first Confiscation Act said that these blacks would be considered contraband of war, seized property of war, and would be used by the Union Army as they saw fit. Well, the second Confiscation Act in the summer of 1862 actually freed these runaway slaves and said if their master was a rebel, they would be freed when they got here. So the 1862 saw the Congress abolishing slavery in Washington, D.C. The border states were told that they ought to maybe take advantage of the offer of Congress to help them pay for their slaves, but they rejected that. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was announced 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, and there President Lincoln offered the preliminary emancipation, which said that slaves would be freed on January 1st, 1863, that there would be colonization attached to this plan of freeing the slaves, that is to send them somewhere outside the country. So 3 months passed after the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and the real one went into effect. And when it did, it had no mention of colonization. Lincoln had given up on that finally as a solution. And there was a call now to form Union Army regiments of black soldiers. Blacks would be admitted to the fighting arm of a Union Army. So Lincoln came a long way as president, and this weakened the South, but it didn't really free anyone on the day it was announced. It only went into effect as the Union Army began to move through the South and liberate the slaves. But it only applied to those parts of the country that Lincoln didn't control. So it was a wartime measure, but it was enforced spottily. Kentucky offered freedom to slaves. If you served in the Union Army, you'd be free. So they offered that. The 13th Amendment passed in this early 1865 was what finally ended slavery in the United States. It was passed by 2/3 of Congress barely and 3/4 of the states. Okay, so blacks served in the Union Army. They made up about 10% of the Army. They were workers first and soldiers after 1863. They fought bravely, but they were considered rebellious slaves, so they were not taken prisoner. They were killed on the battlefield in a couple of battles when they were caught by the slave-owning South as rebellious slaves. They were paid less than white soldiers, so William Walker, a black sergeant of the Massachusetts 54th, had his soldiers stack their rifles, and he refused to fight until they got equal pay. Well, Walker was court-martialed and was executed, and 1 month after this, equal pay became the law of the land, and he got what he was after, but unfortunately, he had to sacrifice his life. They might have made the difference, but no one really knows. So the blacks and blue ended up being the subjects of an army of liberation. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Jesus is, or God's truth is marching on, and his truth is marching on. So that's a great lyric written by her. But the song was already well known. It was already a hit. It was already known as John Brown's Body, his soul that goes marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. John Brown, his soul, his spirit, it continues into the present. So that's very interesting. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Take care.